Hello, and welcome to MDIC's annual public forum. During today's session, we will discuss MDIC's Science of Patient Input Heart Failure Study, an industry-wide collaborative effort to advance the science of regulatory patient preference assessment. Please make sure to join in the conversation on Twitter by following at MDIC Annual Forum and using the hashtag MDICAPF2020. Now, please welcome session moderator and MDIC Clinical Science Program Director, Liliana Rincon-Gonzalez.
Hello, and welcome to this week's MDIC Annual Public Forum session on Patient Preferences for Heart Failure Devices, a collaborative study. I am Liliana Rincon-Gonzalez, Program Director of the Science of Patient Input Initiative at MDIC. In today's session, we will be hearing about MDIC's second disease-specific patient preference study. In this study, we aim to understand patient preferences in heart failure in order to advance the science of regulatory patient preference assessment and to inform clinical trial designs for studying heart failure devices. Before we get started with our session, I would like to take a moment to introduce today's speakers. First, we will hear from Dean Bruhn-Ding, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Quality Assurance at CVRx. He is also the chair of the MDIC Heart Failure Patient Preference Working Group. Then, we will hear from Shelby Reed, Professor in Population Health Sciences and Medicine at Duke University. She is also the Director of the Preference Evaluation Research Group at the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Finally, we will be answering questions after the presentation. Please submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. With that, I turn over to our first speaker.
Thank you, Liliana, and good afternoon. Here's my interest statement. I had the pleasure of chairing this novel work group for MDIC. It is important to establish the foundation of why did we do this project. In particular, the objective of this project was to advance the regulatory science of patient preference assessment by giving medical device industry sponsors, regulatory agencies, preference assessment experts another example of a disease-specific patient preference study. We wanted to build on the past case history and provide another example of a patient preference information study like the Parkinson patient information study that was done for the medical device ecosystem. Many shareholders were involved over the course of the project that I'll get into next. Here you will see who participated in the entire project. This was the first of its kind collaboration spanning many medical device stakeholders afforded in the safe environment of MDIC for developing good regulatory science. In particular, this was the first partnership of 6 industry sponsors to collaborate on a patient preference information study with patients, FDA, and Duke preference experts that would provide valuable heart failure patient preference information for all to use. On this slide, you'll see the industry sponsors that were involved. From a process perspective, this project developed a governance plan that reported into the Science of Patient Input Steering Committee at MDIC with periodic oversight meetings. We developed a heart failure work group with key representatives from each of the sponsored companies that worked with MDIC, the chair, and Dr. Shelby Reed to work the tactical aspects of the project day to day. The timeline identifies key milestones over the life of the project that was effectively completed over the last 18 months. In particular, we kicked off the program in 2018. Sponsors were identified and committed. FDA participated actively. Funding was secured from both sponsors and from FDA. We went through a process where we put out a bid for the subject matter experts, and the Duke Clinical Research Institute was chosen, headed by Dr. Shelby Reed. That was the project leader. Next, we moved into study development in 2019. This was a very busy period where we went through and we identified the attributes that the sponsored companies were interested in studying. We also worked on the contract, and Shelby and her group put together the initial study design. In 2019, the second half, we accelerated the program as it matured, and the attributes were solidified. We contacted patient scientists, got their input on both the attributes and also the risk that we would be looking at, and then a pretest was done. Finally, in 2020 was the execution phase. The design was finalized, the self-referral patient group and the clinician-confirmed patient group completed a web-based survey to provide the study results. And then finally, here in the second part of 2020, the results became available, data analysis was done, and we've gone into the publication and presentation phase, which this is the first part of. The heart failure patient preference study was developed to inform on the trial design and provide some regulatory reference for FDA. Our challenge as a medical device industry is to use the patient preference information studies across the life cycle so patient perspectives are infused into the entire ecosystem. After all, patients are at the heart of everything we do. Thank you. I'll be available for questions at the end of the presentation. I will now turn it over to the program to Dr. Shelby Reed, who will go over the methodology and results.
Well, thank you, Dean. It has been a pleasure collaborating with the working group, the MDIC, and our FDA colleagues. So I want to begin by addressing the study objectives. We sought to apply best practice stated methods to quantify heart failure patients' willingness to accept therapeutic risks in exchange for improved efficacy. This is truly a collaborative effort. We brought in patients, we had providers, cardiologists, device industry representatives, as I mentioned, individuals from the FDA and MDIC. As Dean mentioned, we coordinated this collaboration from Duke in the preferred group. So now let's move forward and talk about the methods we used for this study. So the first big task we had was selecting the attributes, as Dean described. We started by thinking about attributes that were important in developing clinical trials, endpoints that were important to patients. So we were thinking about things like functional capacity, quality of life improvement, number of heart failure hospitalizations, risk of adverse events associated with devices, uncertainty about benefit, of course, concerns about mortality and longevity, and device features. We also had to think about the decision context. What was the motivation for a change in heart failure management? We had to think about the severity of disease. Was this a device that was going to be used in the early phases of heart failure to try to slow down progression of the disease? Or was this something that's going to be used in late stage heart failure? We also had to think about whether we were going to compare one device versus another device, or perhaps a device versus medication. So we had lots of discussions around this, definitely brought in all the stakeholders and had to consider a number of potential devices and what they could do. So we agreed that we would start with patients in stage C heart failure. And so as shown here, these are patients who have developed clinical heart failure. So they have symptoms, signs of heart failure. So that left a lot of room in terms of the level of severity of heart failure and the types of symptoms that these patients may experience on a daily basis. We were fortunate to have some evidence from previous patient preference study in heart failure, in which we were able to discern what were the drivers of choice. And so we saw that it was actually physical functioning, as shown in the bar going up to 10, representing different levels of physical functioning as proxied by NYHA class functioning 1 through 4. By comparison, the number of hospitalizations that a patient would have over 2 years, ranging from 2 hospitalizations to 5 hospitalizations, was relatively unimportant when we were accounting for their level of physical functioning. And then we can see that 30-day mortality risk and severe bleeding risk were also relatively important. So with that information, we really wanted to focus on physical functioning as our main attribute representing efficacy. So we did go back to NYHA class. This is used broadly across heart failure to characterize different levels of functioning that patients have. And so at the top, you can see the descriptions of each of the NYHA classes. When we translated these descriptions for patients in patient-friendly terms, we did so in regard to what they could do and what they could not do in terms of activities they could relate to. So we described their level of functioning in terms of their ability to climb stairs, their ability to do housework, and whether they were out of breath at rest or not. We certainly included longer descriptions than is shown in this shorthand table here. And we provided quiz questions for patients in order to evaluate whether they understood each of these levels and could use them throughout the survey. So the attributes and levels we chose, as I mentioned, physical functioning. Importantly, the study I mentioned before did evaluate changes in NYHA class. We saw that was very important. What that study did not do is evaluate how long patients would remain with different levels of improvement in physical functioning. So that was one of the key things we addressed with this study. And I'll discuss more about that on the next slide. In terms of other attributes, we have risk of mortality, and that ranged from 0% to 15%. We have risk of device-associated complications, ranging from 0% to 40%. And I want to point out that that risk represents an additional 2 days in the hospital, but there were no long-term health consequences from patients who would experience those complications. And then our last attribute was a feature representing different types of heart failure devices. And in this case, we chose remote device programming. This was of interest to the FDA, to engineers at the FDA who have some concerns around hacking these types of devices and the potential adverse effects that patients could incur. Okay, so back to those trajectories representing progression of heart failure. Our baseline or status quo scenario is represented in that top figure. This represents patients would be in NYHA class 3 for 3 years, followed by 2 years in NYHA class 4. Okay. Our next level, this level representing a potential improvement with a heart failure device, is represented by a 1-year gain in NYHA class 3, again, with 2 additional years in NYHA class 4. We also offered an improvement in physical functioning, represented by 1 year with the yellow background, 1 year in NYHA class 2, followed by 3 years in class 3, and again, 4 years in class 4. And then finally, we represented the best level of efficacy with a 1-year gain in NYHA class 2, a 1-year gain in NYHA class 3, and of course, 2 years in NYHA class 4. And you can see that all of these efficacy improvements in terms of functioning also extend a patient's survival duration. Here is an example choice question that we used in our survey instrument, incorporating a discrete choice experiment. In this choice question, you can see that we have the attributes labeled across the top row. Then we have the no device scenario. This no device scenario, again, represents 3 years in NYHA class 3 and 2 years in NYHA class 2. But in these patients choosing no device would incur no additional risk of death and no risk of complications. And of course, there's no remote device settings on no device. So then we have device A and device B. And device B, we're offering the best efficacy level that we're providing, but along with that comes a risk of death and risk of complications. So we ask patients to answer these types of questions multiple times, and based on their pattern of responses, we are able to analyze the data to back out the implicit level of importance they placed on each one of these attribute levels. When we designed the survey instrument, we then took it to patients. We sat down with patients who were referred to us from our clinical colleagues at the Duke University healthcare system. We sat down in face-to-face interviews and WebEx interviews, and we had them read through the survey aloud. We were able to identify texts that didn't work for them. We asked lots of follow-up questions, and we made numerous revisions to the survey instrument based on this important phase in our study. Okay, so in these studies, we incorporate a number of internal validity tests so that we can evaluate the quality of the data that our respondents are providing. So as I mentioned before, we included a number of comprehension questions to evaluate how well our respondents understood our definitions for the attributes, how well they understood the risk arrays that we use to represent risks of adverse events. We also included an experiment, a randomized logic notification experiment. We evaluated how many people chose the same device every single time, which may indicate that they really weren't paying attention, that they were just trying to get through the survey quickly. So we took a look at that. We took a look at dominance patterns, which means how frequently patients were always choosing the device that had the better level of efficacy or perhaps the lower level of risk. We looked at time to completion to identify people who may be speeding through the survey instrument. Then we had some more technical tests that we did to look at consistency of choices across choice questions. And then we included some scope tests. And those are really designed to evaluate whether patients are evaluating the actual magnitude of the benefit or the risk, in this case, the risk, as opposed to its ordinal ranking. Okay, so more on our study design, as well as the experimental design, which dictates the attribute levels combinations that go into those choice questions. So we had the scope test. We randomized respondents to seeing the low risk for mortality, which was 10%, or high risk for mortality, which was 15%. We also had this logic notification experiment. So we were able to incorporate some interesting methodological tests into our study. And then we had, again, the experimental design for the choice questions. So we had 40 blocks of 8 different sets of questions. Each respondent was randomized to one of those 8 or those 40 blocks. The question order, those 8 questions was randomized. And then before the respondents began making their choices across those 8 questions, they saw a dominated choice question, wherein there were 3 options and the devices provided the same level of benefit, but yet had additional risk, where we wanted to evaluate whether patients were carefully considering the risks. So we had a 2-sample study. We were fortunate to be able to have this, to be able to compare whether respondents from a web-based survey like Kantar, or the respondents who had a confirmed clinical diagnosis of heart failure, provided similar preferences. So we had 500 respondents from the Kantar web-based panel, and we collected data on 126 patients from the Duke Health System. Okay, so moving on to the results. So what we see on this slide are the characteristics for our web panel as well as the Duke patients. We see they are similar. About half of the patients in both groups were male. The patients were slightly older at Duke, but they were actually much more likely to be African American in the Duke sample. They had similar characteristics in terms of education. And on the next slide, we see that the patients at Duke actually had a tendency to have more comorbidities, especially with regard to arrhythmias and arthritis. In terms of the type of heart failure, we note that many people were not sure whether they had heart failure with reduced ejection fraction or heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. So in terms of other characteristics, they were similar in terms of reporting the number of days over the past 7 days during which they had symptoms that corresponded to different levels of functioning, as indicated by the NYHA class distribution. Then we have their heart failure management approaches. We see also high levels of medication, but generally similar characteristics across the samples. In terms of some of the internal validity testing that we did, we looked at straight lining, and this is when an individual selected no device, device A or device B every single time. We see that about 8 to 9% of patients in both groups chose no device every time. That may represent a real preference. They were not willing to accept the risks in exchange for the level of benefits that we were offering in the study. Then we also saw a very small fraction of individuals selected device A or device B in all the choice questions. We excluded them from the preference analysis. Taking a look at the time to complete the survey, what we see here is the Duke patients generally took more time with the survey, on average by about 10 minutes. The online panel spent an average of 25 minutes, and the Duke patients spent an average of 35 minutes. So we applied some advanced regression models to these data. The models that we applied are useful for evaluating the extent to which there is heterogeneity in preferences across individuals. And we coded all of the attribute levels as categorical because none of the functional forms seem to fit the data well. And what we see in this slide are the comparison preference weights between the online panel and the Duke patients. You can see they're very similar, with the exception of the no device attribute shown over on the right-hand side. So the more negative preference weight for no device represents patients who are pro-device. So we have a double negative there. So the Duke patients generally tended to want a device more than the online panel. But in regard to the benefits that we see, the higher levels of preferences for more time in NYHA2, more time in NYHA3, they were very similar, as well as the negative utility weights applied for or estimated for the risk of death and risk of complications. Okay, let's go to the next slide, and I'll walk through this a little bit more. So now we've pooled the data from the Duke patients and the online sample. And so again, what we see here over on the left-hand side, we see positive preference weights for an additional year in NYHA2 and an additional year in NYHA3. Okay, they were both statistically significant. In fact, all of the differences in the attribute levels, their utility weights were significantly different, with the exception of the preference weights representing the risk of death of 10% versus 15%. Those were not different. Moving on, I can show you how we use this information to evaluate the extent to which patients are willing to trade off benefits and risks. So if we take a look at that green arrow, the vertical magnitude of that represents the utility improvement that would be achieved with a 1-year gain in NYHA class 2. If we take the length of that green arrow and move it down to the line representing the preferences for the risk of death, we take that magnitude and follow it down, we can see that it corresponds to a risk of death of 6%. We use that to infer that that's the maximum acceptable risk that a patient would be willing to accept if we were to have a device that offered that level of benefit. Okay, we do the same thing for an improvement of 1 year in NYHA class 3 with the orange bar. It's a little bit shorter. So if we move that orange bar down, it doesn't make it as far down that risk line. So that represents a maximum acceptable risk of approximately 5%. Okay. We use the same approach to estimate the maximum acceptable risk of complications. And then I also want to point out our preference weight for the remote device programming attribute. You can see that over on the right-hand side. It is slightly positive. It's significant, but patients, we can infer, are not willing to accept a lot of risk in order to have that feature. Okay. Then what we see on the right-hand side, the very most right-hand side circle, and the bar representing a pro-device preference. We also see that this was estimated for every patient across 613 respondents, and the confidence interval is quite wide. That's indicating that there's probably a fair degree of heterogeneity in preferences for a device versus no device. We have summarized our maximum acceptable risk estimates for 30-day mortality and for in-hospital complications. Again, here you can see that a year of improvement in functioning equivalent to NYHA2 equates to a maximum acceptable risk of 6%, 5% with a gain of 1 year in NYHA class 3. And then if we were to have a device that could offer both a year in NYHA2 and a year in NYHA class 3, the inferred maximum acceptable risk would be 11%. Okay. On the right-hand side, we have the maximum acceptable risk for those in-hospital complications. Again, they're much larger. There are no long-term consequences of these, so people are willing to accept an appreciable level of risk of these complications. Remember, I just spoke about the heterogeneity that is represented by the wide confidence interval for the no device preference parameter. What we can do is use latent class analysis in order to evaluate different preference patterns that may be underlying these data that we saw in our pooled model. These latent class analyses are also useful in terms of identifying respondent characteristics that have lower or higher probability of being in these classes with distinct preference patterns. So we applied this approach to the 613 respondents, and we chose a 3-class model. We saw 3 preference patterns emerging from the data. What is shown by this graphic is the reduction in AIC and BIC fit statistics. So you can see a dramatic reduction, which represents a clear distinction between 2 groups, 2 classes. And then we ultimately chose a 3rd class. And on the next slide, you'll see that the 3rd class is quite different. So our 2 large classes are represented at the top, class 1 and class 2. So class 2 represents approximately 66% of our sample. So what we see are similar preference patterns qualitatively in both class 1 and class 2. So again, we see positive preferences for gains in functioning, and then we see negative preferences for the risk of death and risk of complications. But what distinguishes these 2 groups is that no device parameter. Okay, you can see that in class 1, again, our large group representing almost 2/3 of our sample, they are very pro-device oriented. In class 2, we see more of a preference for no device, but they will accept a device when we're offering sufficient benefit for the risk. Okay, so these people, I would say they're on the fence. You have to offer these folks a really good device before they'll take it. And then we have class 3, and they have generally some disordered preference patterns. But what we see that really strikes us is the parameter estimate for the no device feature. Okay, these people are strongly anti-device. Okay, so that's why I wanted to pull them out of the model. This represents those same maximum acceptable risk estimates by latent class for the first two latent classes, or large ones. It was not reasonable to estimate maximum acceptable risk for the third class because those folks weren't planning to get a device. There's no level, even a 0% risk, they were not willing to get a device. So we see across, our almost 85% of our sample in class 1, these patients were willing to accept a 9% risk of 30-day mortality for an improvement of 1 year in NYHA 2, and then 7% in NYHA 3. Our second class was much more risk averse. You can see that those patients were only willing to accept a 3% risk of mortality for a year in NYHA 2 and 2% in NYHA 3. We see the same pattern, of course, for in-hospital complications, where there was a clear distinction in their willingness to accept these risks. Okay, and on the next slide, what we see is we can recover our pooled estimates of maximum acceptable risk when we weighted the estimates from class 1 and class 2. Again, as I mentioned, another advantage of latent class analysis is we can identify patient characteristics that are associated with probabilities of class membership. So in our large class, class 1, we'll call them the pro-device folks, they were more likely to be male. They were more likely to have less symptoms associated with heart failure, so earlier phases of heart failure in class 1 and class 2. They were more likely to be white than non-white. They were more likely to have a diagnosis of an arrhythmia, and more likely, or those patients were more likely to be in class 1, let me say, and those patients with a cardiac device were more likely to be in class 1. Okay. For class 2, there were no predictors of class membership. And then in class 3, we saw that females were more likely to be members of class 3, this anti-device class. Those without an arrhythmia were more likely to be in this anti-device class, and those with no previous cardiac device were more likely to be in this anti-device class. So taking a look on the next slide at the magnitude of these effects, what we see here are the black bars, again, representing the overall probability of class membership. So we can see in the orange bar, that represents among females how likely they are to be in class 1. And then we see amongst those with more advanced heart failure, they were less likely to be members of class 1, the pro-device group. White patients were slightly more likely than non-white patients to be members of this class. But then we see arrhythmia, patients with arrhythmia and patients with a prior cardiac device were much more likely to be members of class 1. Okay, again, no predictors for class 2. And then for class 3, we saw that those patients with arrhythmias or devices were unlikely to be in class 3. They were very pro-device oriented. Just want to summarize our results. So what we saw was that the majority of participants in this study with heart failure strongly preferred a device, and they were willing to accept 9 or 7% risk of mortality for 1 year gains in survival that equated to another year of functioning in NYHA class 2 or NYHA class 3. Approximately 1 in 5 were less risk tolerant. They were willing to only accept mortality risks in the 2 to 3% range. And we saw that participants who were more likely to be in one of these larger classes were much more accepting of in-hospital complications for gains in functioning and survival. And we saw that the preference weights from the online panel were quite similar to the patients we recruited from Duke. So thank you for your attention. We will now take questions through the Q&A box.
Thank you for attending MDIC's annual public forum. We hope you will join us next week for the final session in our series, where we will discuss computational modeling and simulation toward good simulation practices. Visit apf.mdic.org for more information and to catch up on previous sessions.